Hi, and welcome to my channel. This is the Tobacco Barn by Real Scale Models Redux. What do I mean by that? Over the years, I've put a lot of build videos on my YouTube channel, but the earlier ones only had photos showing what I was doing. Now that I can add narration, I've gone back to some of the more popular ones and redone them with me telling what I'm doing. This one is the Tobacco Barn from Real Scale Models. The tobacco barn was once an essential ingredient in the process of air curing tobacco. Tobacco barns were as unique as each area in which they were erected, and there is no one design that can be described as a tobacco barn. Now, when you open the box, you find a great set of directions along with laser-cut wood for the siding and for the brick foundation, roofing materials, detail parts, and strip wood. The first thing I did was I scratched up the wood some using my wire brushes to give it texture. Then I used my Ultimation slicer to cut my bracing. Now, since the siding is board and batten, I attached my bracing in a horizontal direction because that's the way that the siding is going to want to curl if you put stain on it. I also used the bracing to attach the upper gable ends. Then I went through my selection of stains and picked a couple shades that I wanted to use on the walls. I used lighter shades at the upper portion of the walls and darker shades near the bottom. Then, before I cut apart the brick foundation, I mixed a couple shades of red to use for the bricks. At first they look really bright, but then I used a distress crayon to put my mortar in. And when I apply that, it also coats the bricks and tones them down some. You can see on the upper part how the mortar goes into the bricks, and you can now see how the entire piece of foundation is toned down. Now, after staining the walls, it's time to glue the building together. I do this by first making two L shapes, making sure they're at 90 degrees. Then I take those two assemblies and glue them together into one building. Then I started on the foundation. I couldn't make the L assemblies because of the opening, but I just used a block and made sure all of them were at 90-degree angles and that they fit underneath the building, making sure there was just a tiny bit of overhang over the foundation. Then I started working on the doors and the vents at the top of the gable ends. I used Copic markers to color them, and then I used an X-Acto knife to chew up the bottoms of the doors. I put the gable end vents in place and used a little stick to prop them open. Then, using the parts that come in the kit, I put together the doors and glued them in place. Then I glued the roof in place, including the little vent on top. I cut a bunch of rafter tails that I was going to attach underneath the roof. The way I did this, I put the roof down on the building and mark out the ends of the rafter tails. Then I go through and mark even sections where they would fall. Then when I put the roof back in place, I have marks to show where each one's going to go, and this spaces them out evenly, and they end up looking like this. Now, for the upper gable areas, I put small nail holes in place and then used an AK watercolor pencil to make them look as if they're rusting. Now it's time to work on the metal roofing. I brought the sheets over to my spray booth and painted them with a primer. Then I came back and used artist pigments to do my rusting on them. I like using these, and I used a couple different shades and a binder to hold them in place. And then, after test fitting, I used super glue to hold them in place. Then I turned my attention to the smoke jack. First I primed it, and then using a brush on, I put a dark black sooty paint on it. Then, after gluing it in place, I started using my artist pigments to weather the entire building. I love using pigments for this type of weathering. There's so many opportunities for different shades and different textures, and it really brings a structure alive, I feel. I started working on the overhang on the front of the barn. After putting a light coat of gray paint on the construction paper, I scuffed it up with sandpaper and then glued it onto the cardstock roof that came in the kit. Then I put some fascia pieces around the roof, and I used my slicer to cut some supports that would go underneath it as rafters. I glued the rafters in place and also cut some leg supports for it. I used a rubber band and block to hold those in place while the glue was drying. Then I attached that onto the front of my barn. Now it was time for some details. I rusted and glued on the nut bolt washer castings onto the supports for the front overhang. Then I started painting a few little details that would go on the diorama. The partial palette there is actually a metal casting, and because of that I wanted to try this Vallejo old and new wood effects to see how much I could get the metal to look like wood. The process uses a variety of paints in a different order and using different methods of applying them, and it brings out the highlights and shadows and does give a pretty good impression of old wood, even on a metal casting that just had primer on it. Once I was done with it and put the dark stain on it, it came out looking better than I had expected it would. Now I started working on the base for the diorama. I had already put the barn on it and traced around it to know where it was going to go. I used some Vallejo ground texture and mixed a couple of acrylic colors into it. Then after putting down some strip wood to show where the foundation would sit, I spread it on the diorama and let it dry. I then used some scenic cement and fine ballast and Activa to spread around some gravel and cinders in different areas where the barn would sit. Then I glued the barn down to the base and into the holes that I had made where the roof supports would go. And then it was time to start putting the details around the barn. This was my pallet that I put a couple of barrels on, and I put it in place, and a few other details around the building. Then I used some Martin Welberg scenery details to put some foliage around the building. I like using the Martin Welberg products, and I wish I had taken a couple pictures of actually applying them. Now is time to take it outside and take a few pictures of it. I'm really happy with how this building came out. It was a very easy structure to build. I'm glad Railscale Models came out with this kit. And I hope you enjoyed watching how it was built and maybe got a tip or two out of it. Thank you for watching.